child, lost in the fog, and I'm frightened of meeting all you known unknown.
Hello and welcome to Poly Risk Reward. My name is Ned Stranger, and in 2024, my wife and I received the results of a DNA paternity test that showed that I'm not our daughter's biological father. Through these podcasts, I tell the story of our open marriage and this unexpected twist in forensic detail, with each episode focusing on a common question I get about open marriage, polyamory, and this unusual situation. When I was growing up, one of my first jobs was to volunteer at a summer camp. And I remember I must have been about 12 at the time. I was walking across a playing field with two of my friends and this older staff member who was about 18. And I asked him, what one piece of advice would you have for us young guys as we're about to enter teenagehood and the scary world of sex and dating? And he stopped and looked at us, and he didn't have to think about it. He just looked at us and said, always wrap your knob. Now, I was a very impressionable child, and bits of advice like this really stuck with me. So, for example, I've always put the toilet seat down after use, because one time when I was 6, the older sister of one of my friends told me in no uncertain terms how disgusting it was not to do this. And so she basically scared me into always having that habit for the rest of my life. And that was the kind of kid I was. And this staff member's advice around always using condoms also really stuck with me. And it meant that when I did enter the world of love and sex and dating, I had no problem sticking to this habit of safe sex. Now, in our open marriage, using condoms is the second of our only 2 rules. And for the first rule, you can listen back to last week's episode where I describe the rule and tell the funny story that sparked it. But the second rule is to always use condoms when having sexual intercourse with other people. To explore the Ned test from a few episodes ago about whether the rule is good or not, it's clear in that we understand exactly what we have to do. If we're having sex with other people, we have to use condoms. It's easy enough to comply with, although I will talk in this episode about just how inconvenient condoms can be. And thirdly, it's obviously justified in that it reduces the risk of diseases, but also the risk of unwanted pregnancies. So far, so good. Now, the only problem with that older staff member's advice is that I never had to go through that soul-searching process of really understanding why condoms are important in detail and either educating myself or being educated in them. And when it came to writing my book and recording these podcasts, I realized that I had a knowledge gap. And so this is an attempt to fill that knowledge gap. First, though, a little potted history of the condom, because it's all quite fun. So there's not a lot of definite recorded use of condoms before the 1400s, but around Asia we start then to see things being used just to cover the tip. And these would be made out of various different materials, it seems. So they could be made out of oiled silk paper, or tortoise shell, or lamb intestines. So quite a lot of very unpleasant materials. And it was only around the Renaissance in Europe that we see more widespread use of condoms as a way of fighting syphilis. It seems like the most common material was linen around that time. And actually there's journal entries from the famous Italian lover Giacomo Casanova from the 1700s that he would use linen tied on with ribbon. So if you think that putting on a condom now is inconvenient, then imagine having to tie linen every single time. I mean, I can barely tie a ribbon on a birthday present, so that would totally screw me. But also it seems that animal intestines came in to replace linen as a more comfortable covering for wrapping your knob. And it was only around 1840 that rubber came in as the most popular material because it was reusable and washable and a good barrier against syphilis, and that's how it was marketed. Then in 1920, that's when latex came in as the most common material for making condoms, in that it was very easily manufactured on a large scale and cheaply. And then you started to see countries issuing condoms to soldiers during the Second World War as a way of fighting disease on the front line. But how effective are they in preventing unwanted pregnancies? This is where the number 98% had always been in my head, so I knew they were 98% effective. But only when I started writing my book did I realize I didn't actually know what that number meant. So I started researching, and it turns out that what it means is if you have 100 couples having regular sex throughout the year and they're using condoms perfectly, then of that 100, on average, only 2 of those couples will get pregnant. And for context, this is compared with without any form of contraception. You have 100 couples throughout the year having sex. On average, 85% of them will get pregnant. So it reduces the risk from 85% down to 2%. Now that's with perfect use. And that means you're putting it on properly, you're using the right lube, you're using the right size, you're not accidentally tearing it, you're not starting to have sex and then putting it on, which seems very illogical to me. And so with imperfect use, even then, how people generally use it, you have an 87, maybe 85%, depending on the study, effectiveness rate. And these statistics, for context, come from the World Health Organization and the NHS in the UK. So very authoritative studies. They're also very effective in reducing the risk of sexual diseases, but I'm going to be getting a guest on the podcast quite soon, and we're going to talk about all of that in a lot more detail with some studies and facts. And I didn't want this episode to also turn into a long list of statistics. For now, I'm especially interested in this idea of how easy it is to comply with the rule to use condoms. So what reasons are there that people don't use them, and what ways are there to make those problems less problematic, if that makes sense? So that's where we're going to go next. So what are the most common reasons why people don't use condoms or don't like to use them? Well, here my research took me to a whole stream of studies done in different parts of the world, published in different scientific journals from the last decade or two. And what we see is a pattern emerging where the same types of reason against condoms keep coming up again and again, regardless of where you are or what your sexual orientation is. And so I'm going to explore some of the most common categories now and also explore ways of alleviating those problems. So one of the most common reasons people don't like condoms is this idea that they somehow reduce the pleasure, either by reducing sensitivity inside or maybe even interrupting the flow and this like intimate energy that's been developed. So in looking for inspiration on how to combat this, I thought, what better place to learn about sex than to read a book? And I found a book called The Guide to Getting It On by Paul Ioannidis, where he explores this exact topic. For him, part of the challenge is making condoms part of the build-up rather than only introducing them at the point that they're needed. So he gives a number of examples of how couples can keep each other aroused whilst putting on or introducing the condom into the mix. For example, he talks about anticipation, and I quote, "A woman slips a condom into her partner's pocket, followed by a welcome kiss, fingertips across the front of his pants, and a few words about what she's looking forward to once the condom is on." So very stirring stuff. But even once you're started, there are various ways of making the putting on of the condom much sexier, and examples he includes are grinding, talking dirty, hand action, while sitting on his face or while masturbating. So plenty of options there for you.
And you don't know
Another of the most common reasons why people don't use condoms, especially in monogamous relationships, is this fear that it somehow shows a lack of trust. And this is especially a risk that one partner might pressure the other into not using them by effectively guilt-tripping them. Well, if you want to use them, clearly you don't trust me. This is a big risk, especially the studies show men pressuring women not to use condoms. Now, this is more relevant in monogamous relationships, but trust is obviously hugely important in polyamorous relationships and open marriages, because not only do Anya and I need to trust one another if we're willing to have unprotected sex with each other, knowing that the other person is using condoms with their other partners, but we also know that the partners outside the marriage also need to trust us and our partners, if that makes sense. So this is where it can get very complicated, and this is one of the biggest challenges of polyamory and making sure everyone feels safe. And I think this is where obviously communication is hugely important. So I always try to find ways to demonstrate how much I think about this stuff and how important it is to me. I'll never ever go on a date without condoms. I'll never even remotely entertain the possibility of not using them. I make it very clear up front that this is one of the only rules in our marriage. And I think all of that demonstrates to new partners and people I date that I take this stuff really, really seriously. Now, this is all very well, but the studies do show that there's a risk of people pleasing their partner by not using condoms because they don't want their partner to feel like they don't trust them. Basically, that's the issue. Other common reasons why people don't use condoms include cultural and religious norms, where, for example, condoms are frowned upon by the church, and this obviously varies largely region to region based on the studies. There may also be practical issues getting hold of condoms, let's say because you're having spontaneous sex with someone you just met at a Ned Stranger concert, which would be very cool if people do that at my concerts. And that's why having condom machines where you can buy them, especially in discreet locations, is really important, because some people also feel stigma buying them, let's say, in a pharmacy because they just feel self-conscious. Maybe they worry about being judged for being promiscuous. This is something that still comes up in the studies. Another big reason why people don't use condoms is that they're blind to the risks of sexual disease and maybe don't understand how they're transmitted and how effective condoms could be. Now, I realize that this episode has dipped in places but still been relatively surface level, and I'm not a scientific expert, I'm not a health expert, and I'm not looking to give professional advice on this stuff, but I do want to go into more detail. And so within the next couple of weeks, I'm going to be having a conversation episode with a very special guest where we dive into this all in a lot more detail. So if you haven't already subscribed, please subscribe on your platform of choice. And if you're enjoying the show, remember to recommend it to your friends so I can spread the word. For now, thank you for listening to this episode of Poly Risk Reward. My name's Ned Stranger, and I'll see you all next week.
You're just growing old, waiting for the fight to unfold. And now underneath the buildings bear their many teeth, and steel and glass and false belief rising up and leaving you behind.